On February 1, 1949, a 66-year-old widow named Janet Fay packed her suitcases, withdrew her life savings, and walked out of her Albany, New York apartment alongside a polished, attentive stranger she had met through a newspaper advertisement. She believed she was embarking on a late-in-life romance. She believed she had finally found warmth in the twilight of her life. What she had actually found was a death trap meticulously crafted by two of the most chillingly effective predators of the post-war era. Within days of leaving her home, Janet Fay's life savings of over $6,000, a fortune at the time, had been completely drained. Her frantic family received brief, strangely phrased, typed letters. Those typed letters were the first fatal misstep in Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck's murder spree. Janet Fay had never owned a typewriter in her life. She was a woman who wrote every letter by hand in a distinct, measured penmanship, filling pages with detailed news about her daily routines and her deep Catholic faith. More importantly, she was almost completely illiterate when it came to modern office machinery. When her relatives in Albany opened envelopes containing terse, mechanically typed notes claiming she had suddenly left for Florida with a new husband, suspicion was immediate. Her sister recognized that the tone was utterly foreign, the phrasing was cold, and the signature at the bottom was a clumsy, desperate imitation. Her family did not wait for further word. They took the typed letters directly to the police. What the family did not know was that Janet Fay was already dead, buried beneath a layer of fresh concrete in a quiet suburban basement. The truth of what happened in that rented Long Island apartment reveals the terrifying dynamics that transformed a lucrative fraud scheme into a series of brutal homicides. In early January of 1949, 66-year-old Janet Fay had traveled from Albany to New York, convinced she was embarking on a late-in-life marriage with a cultured, prosperous suitor. Instead, she entered a volatile domestic trap. Martha Beck's growing hatred for the older woman was no longer hidden beneath the guise of a protective relative. The breaking point arrived when Janet Fay witnessed an intimate gesture between the supposed brother and sister, instantly shattering the facade. Recognizing that she had been lured into a trap, Fay panicked and threatened to contact her family and the authorities. That threat sealed her fate. In a violent rage, Martha Beck seized a ballpeen hammer and struck the 66-year-old woman in the head, shattering her skull in a sudden outburst of feral jealousy. As Janet Fay collapsed to the floor bleeding, the terrifying shift in their partnership was fully realized. They had moved beyond financial predation into cold-blooded homicide. Raymond Fernandez, horrified by the mess but entirely complicit in the enterprise, stepped in to finish the act. He wrapped a towel tightly around Fay's neck, strangling her until her frantic gasps ceased completely. The immediate aftermath exposed a chilling level of cold, methodical calculation. Instead of fleeing in panic, the pair spent hours meticulously scrubbing the apartment floor with bleach, stripping the crime scene of any biological evidence. They lifted Fay's limp body into a large trunk, crammed her remaining possessions alongside her, and transported the trunk to a rented apartment in Queens, New York. There, in the dim light of a basement, Fernandez dug a shallow hole in the dirt floor, deposited the trunk, and poured a fresh layer of concrete over the grave. With Fay buried beneath several inches of concrete, the duo wasted no time exploiting her estate. Fernandez forged her signature on her savings accounts and checks, successfully plundering over $6,000. To the outside world, Janet Fay had simply vanished on a sudden holiday with her new companion. But for her family, the sudden silence was entirely out of character. Janet Fay was a woman of rigid routine. She wrote to her sister regularly, kept precise records, and never left home without notifying those closest to her. When typed letters signed with her name began arriving at her sister's house, alarm bells rang immediately. Janet had never used a typewriter in her life. Worse still, the writer misspelled the names of close relatives, mistakes the real Janet Fay would never make. Her family took the letters straight to the police, initiating a missing persons investigation that quietly began tracing the footsteps of a man who was already disappearing into another woman's life. By the time investigators began comparing notes across county lines, Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck had already moved Janet Fay from her Manhattan apartment to a rented house in Valley Stream, Long Island. They presented themselves as a respectable family unit, with Martha posing as Raymond's sister-in-law. But inside the home, the tension was rising rapidly. Janet was 66 years old, deeply religious, and possessed a shrewd financial instincts that began to reassert themselves once the initial thrill of courtship faded. She began asking direct questions about her money, her bank books, and why Martha was constantly present in what was supposed to be a romantic getaway. What Janet Faye did not realize was that her questions were accelerating a deadline that had already been set the moment she signed over her assets. Martha Beck's jealousy, always volatile, was reaching a breaking point as she watched Raymond shower Janet with performative affection to keep her compliant. On the night of January 4, 1949, the facade fractured completely. An argument erupted in the bedroom when Janet caught Martha going through her personal belongings. When Janet threatened to leave and call the police, Martha snapped. Armed with a heavy Ballpeen hammer, she struck Janet across the head, knocking her to the floor. Raymond, hearing the commotion, rushed into the room, not to stop the attack, but to complete it. Fearing that the noise would alert neighbors, he wrapped a towel tightly around Janet's neck and strangled her until she stopped moving. The brutality was swift, but what followed was a cold, calculated operation designed to erase Janet Faye from existence. They stuffed her body into a trunk, wiped the bedroom down with disinfectant, and loaded the trunk into the back of a car. But they faced an immediate problem. They needed a place to bury the body where it would never be uncovered by land surveyors or curious passersby. They drove to South Ozone Park in Queens, where Raymond rented a modest single-family home. In the basement, under the cover of darkness, Raymond dug a shallow pit into the dirt floor, pushed the trunk into the cavity, and covered it with a fresh layer of concrete. To any casual observer, it looked like a routine home improvement project. With Janet buried beneath 3 inches of cement, the pair systematically liquidated her life. Raymond forged her signature on bank withdrawal slips, cleared out her savings accounts, and cashed in her stocks, netting approximately $6,000, a substantial sum at the time. Yet for Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck, $6,000 was not a fortune to retire on. It was merely funding for their next operation. As police in New York were just beginning to catalog Janet Faye's missing bank records, the pair had already left the state, traveling west toward the quiet suburbs of Michigan. They were following a fresh trail opened by another personal advertisement, completely unaware that their movements were starting to leave a trail of digital footprinting through interstate telegraph wires, postal money order receipts, and cross-jurisdictional police communications. The paper trail was catching up, but not quickly enough to prevent another tragedy. In late January 1949, Raymond Fernandez and Martha Beck arrived in the quiet community of Byron Center, Michigan, just outside Grand Rapids. Their target was Delphine Downing, a 28-year-old widow raising her 2-year-old daughter, Raynell. Downing had responded to Fernandez's personal advertisement seeking romance and companionship, completely unaware that the man standing on her porch was a calculated predator, or that the solemn, overweight woman introduced as his sister was in fact his devoted partner in crime. For the first few days, the dynamic followed the familiar pattern Fernandez had perfected over years of swindling vulnerable women. He presented himself as a prosperous, cultured businessman of Spanish origin, while Beck filled the role of supportive kin, keeping household affairs running smoothly. But almost immediately, subtle frictions began to undermine the deception. Unlike previous victims who had been isolated or elderly, Delphine Downing was young, observant, and deeply attached to her home and daughter. She quickly noticed strange discrepancies in the stories Fernandez told about his background and finances. That suspicion deepened when Downing witnessed an alarming physical transition. When Fernandez removed his custom toupee in a moment of relaxation, his entire appearance changed, unnerving Downing and prompting her to question his identity. Even more troubling was the suffocating, possessive behavior of Beck. Far from acting like a dutiful sister, Beck exhibited intense, barely concealed jealousy whenever Fernandez showed physical affection toward Downing. The atmosphere inside the small suburban home grew increasingly volatile. As Downing's distress morphed into outright panic, Fernandez attempted to calm her using heavy sedatives. He administered a dose of sleeping pills, leaving Downing incapacitated in her bedroom. But what was intended to keep her quiet instead escalated the situation into a point of no return. As Downing lay unconscious, her 2-year-old daughter, Raynell, began to cry uncontrollably, reacting to her mother's unresponsiveness and the presence of 2 sinister strangers in her home. This created an immediate crisis for the pair. They knew that if Downing awoke and realized she had been drugged, she would immediately contact local authorities. Their financial scam had imploded before they could access her accounts or liquidate her assets. Up to this point, Fernandez had relied primarily on psychological manipulation and fraud, resorting to murder only when his victim, Janet Faye, threatened public exposure in New York. Now, stranded in Michigan, the duo made the decision to execute their host to eliminate any chance. Check formatting, ensure no headings, no subheadings, no bold text, no stage directions like pause, no markdown bullets. Check seamless continuation, must connect directly to. Now, stranded in Michigan, the duo made the decision to execute their host to eliminate any chance. Maintain exact tone, objective, authoritative, documentary-style narration, high-retention phrasing, precise narrative building. Word count target, 2,100 words. Let's make sure it's sufficiently long, thorough, detailed. Of exposure. Delphine Downing, already distressed and weeping after discovering Raymond Fernandez had lied about his identity and intention, was given a heavy dose of sleeping pills under the guise of calming her nerves. As the sedatives took hold and Downing fell into an unconscious stupor, Fernandez retrieved a revolver. He shot her directly through the head, killing her instantly in her own home. But the murder immediately created a horrifying new complication that neither killer had properly planned for. Delphine's 2-year-old daughter, Raynell, was still in the house, now orphaned and crying incessantly for her mother. For 2 full days, Fernandez and Martha Beck remained inside the Byron Road residence, attempting to maintain a facade of normalcy while deciding how to deal with the child. The infant's relentless crying threatened to draw the attention of nearby neighbors in the tight-knit Michigan suburb. Beck's patience wore thin. Rather than fleeing or dropping the toddler off at an orphanage, Beck took the 2-year-old down to the basement, filled a wash basin, and held the child underwater until she drowned. The duo then buried both mother and child beneath a freshly poured layer of concrete in the cellar floor. Yet, despite their careful attempts to conceal the crime scene, they made a critical error in assessing the social dynamics of small-town Michigan. Delphine Downing was a woman of routine, and her sudden disappearance did not go unnoticed. A neighbor, suspicious of the strange couple occupying Downing's house while her car remained parked outside, raised the alarm. When questioned by neighbors, Fernandez claimed Delphine had gone on an extended vacation and left him in charge of selling the property. But the neighbors were not convinced, noticing that clothes were left on the line and that Delphine would never leave her young daughter behind without notice. Local police were notified, and officers arrived at the home on March 1, 1949, catching Fernandez and Beck completely off guard as they were packing their bags to flee. Initial police questioning seemed routine, but investigators quickly detected inconsistencies in the pair's statements. When officers inspected the basement, they noticed a patch of concrete that was notably darker and wetter than the surrounding floor. Pressed on the physical evidence, Fernandez's composure shattered. In a surprising display of fatalism, he confessed to the murders of Delphine and Raynell, Downing right there in the basement. Investigators immediately chipped away the unseasoned cement, uncovering the bodies of the mother and child. Yet, as detectives began processing what appeared to be a horrific domestic crime, they uncovered a collection of documents inside Fernandez's luggage that transformed a localized homicide into a national criminal investigation. Search warrants executed on their belongings yielded hundreds of letters, ledgers, and photographs detailing correspondences with dozens of women across the country. The paper trail revealed a systematic, multi-state operation targeting lonely, middle-aged women who had posted advertisements in romance magazines. Investigators realized that Delphine Downing was not an isolated outburst of violence, but merely the final stop in a long, calculated trail of fraud, extortion, and murder. The sheer volume of names in Fernandez's address books suggested that the true scope of their crimes stretched far beyond Michigan borders. As news of the arrests broke, law enforcement agencies across the United States began cross-referencing their open missing persons files against the names found in Fernandez's ledgers. Within days, authorities in New York made a definitive connection. 66-year-old Janet Faye, a wealthy widow from Albany, had disappeared in January 1949 after meeting a man matching Fernandez's description, accompanied by a woman claiming to be his sister. Faye had withdrawn her life savings of over $6,000 shortly before vanishing. The Michigan arrest suddenly offered New York detectives their first solid lead in a case that had completely stalled. Confronted with the physical evidence recovered from Faye's abandoned apartment and bank records, Fernandez began to divulge details of their previous movements. He admitted that he and Beck had taken Janet Faye to a rented apartment in Flushing, Queens. There, after Faye grew suspicious about her missing funds, Beck had struck her in the head.